that disincentive fee is tacked on the front. So you pay your regular permit fee, and you pay disincentive fee on whatever amount of water that you're using above the regulatory plan. Above the regulatory plan line. If during the process of your permit, it's determined that you've exceeded the regulatory allotment, either by exceeding your percentage, or just going over the 10 million gallons, then that disincentive fee is held on the back end of the permit. So if through a compromise and settlement or through an amendment, it comes in a different place. So what you see here, these two different colors there on the left-hand side and on the right-hand side, is disincentive fee that's coming from income, which is the darker color. That's a disincentive fee for permit income, which is on the front end. And then disincentive fee on the back end, which is compromise and settlement, is the lighter color. So generally, if you think about this as a process, in any given year, permittees that last year had disincentive fee for compromise and settlement ultimately end up in the income side, because we figured that out. This is part of the regular permitting once they figure out some kind of solution to avoid it. But overall, disincentive fee revenue has increased from year to year, particularly in recent years. This going back to 2018. A lot of that is tied into the change in the rate, which has gone up with the city of Houston's rate. I'll tell you that the amount of groundwater associated with this revenue is less than 1% of all the groundwater used in the district. It's a really small number. But because of the size of the rate, the revenue can be quite large, at least compared to our regular permit fee, which is orders of magnitude less. But overall, over the last 3 years, we have seen the revenue, at least for the most part, flat now. If you look at it over a longer period of time, there's been a steady increase. We did have a drought in 2023, which can linger on the permitting process for several years, so that can be biasing the revenue a little bit higher. But ultimately, when we set forth and put the rate in, did an index rate back in 2015 ish, then the expectation was that over time, as that rate went up, we would begin to see some of the disincentive fee folks, disincentive permittees fall off. And although we have seen that, because of the rate increase, you really can't see it in the data that is shown here. Any questions on disincentive fee revenue?
So, if we looked at over pumpage, if we looked at over pumpage in the areas where the permits are all aggregate, do we have a feel for how much water is actually being over pumped, but it's being washed within that bigger permit by those that aren't using as much as?
Well, it's hard, it can be hard to tease that out, but it's part of an aggregate system. We don't, although we get that level of detail inside of that, the process will roll up into one. So if we could dig into that pretty close. You could dig into that. We haven't done it on the big aggregate permits, where we see most of the when we see an overage on an aggregate permit, particularly a large aggregate permit, those overages are related to a groundwater reduction plan. In many cases, they're handled through credits, and the percentages are pretty small. The amount of water can be a sizable amount of water, but percentages can be pretty small.
And where I guess that's really relevant to us is a discussion we had a couple board meetings ago about where we see within an aggregate permit or within a GRP, we've got a hot spot. It's being washed at the end of the calculation, but in terms of the actual impact on subsidence, we are able to see that.
Yeah, so, and that's, I think, ultimately, we're gonna have discussions about that, but that is, we had a groundwater reduction plan discussion today. Groundwater reduction plans are great for us. They allow time for infrastructure to be developed. They also provide an exemption from disincentive fee while they're active and viable. And during that period of time, subsidence is going to occur, as we've seen it occur historically. Where that's going to become a bigger question and how it relates to the finances and ultimately to the policy is when we get beyond the GRP. GRP is no longer there. They're at 20%, or whatever the 35 requirement is. GRP requirement matches the regular requirement, so the GRP goes away. And now, we begin to look at that on a more, on a finer scale. And ultimately, from a financial perspective, that's gonna require us to look at it closer. I don't wanna give the impression that they're not being looked at, but we have to look at it very, very close on the use side, be able to make those connections and begin to help those folks, deal with it.
Yeah, but is there any step function with the next level of going to 60% conversion? Some of the areas are expecting to have more people have additional funds made in disincentive, and that'll show up in next year's revenue?
Yeah, so, because they're all tied to a GRP, the 60% is tied to a GRP, you know, I do expect that we'll see most of that deal with their credits if it's necessary, so I don't see there being an impact on science and on SRF fund revenue, disincentive revenue. Everybody else is not in the GRP is already at 20, or they're, when alternative water available, and they're 10 million gallons. So those guys, those folks, those permittees are more likely impacted by climate than anything else. By climate, I mean prior, they need more water is what I think.
I thought the West had implemented a automated meter reading system throughout their region. And if so, you probably could get detailed data from each of the.
We actually do get the data from each well, each well and aggregate permit regardless of the aggregate permit. So they're required to meter all of those wells. So we do get that information. But from a permitting perspective and a compliance perspective, all of that is added up into that one data.
Well, but I'm thinking from a reporting perspective, not having to do anything. If we think that this well should only be producing this much, and anything above that would be quote unquote disincentive.
Or should be disincentive.
Or should be disincentive, even if it's not. I'm just saying, somebody could probably go through that was good at reporting and pull that data out and identify, you know, which wells are worse and what the impact is.
Yeah, and those policy discussions haven't been had yet, but that'll be part of the discussion on how we deal with that. There's a lot of different pieces that go into ultimately how we'll work with that after we get beyond the GRP phase. But ultimately, I think what we'll end up is kind of where we are today. We're gonna do what we can to complete our mission objectives and make it so that it's easy for folks to comply and not incur disincentive fees instead of really choosing to do so.
Well, I see there'd be a big problem if we say, you know, the GRP goes away at some point. There's all sorts of things, you know, who's gonna handle all that AMR function and who's gonna be doing a bunch of things that currently happen if the GRP isn't there.
Yeah, and let me just clarify, I don't want to be misconception. When I say that the GRP goes away, I don't expect the GRP, the managing of that aggregate system to go away. It's going to be managed by that entity. What I'm referring to more from a policy perspective, that exemption is no longer there because they're at the same percentage. But the management of that will be managed by an authority or wherever the GRP manager is today. They're still going to manage those wells, it's going to be providing all that, it's going to be like the fees from it. So that won't change, but from a compliance perspective, you look at it a little bit differently.
Yeah, the permit will still remain the same, but the GRP kind of disappears.
The GRP exemption is no longer available.
Gotcha.
Hopefully it confuses us.
I was confused.
So as we look at some of the things that we have coming up on science and research, continuation of ongoing program, the University of Houston to continue to process our GTS data. I do expect that with the addition of additional staff in science and research, we'll be able to build some expertise in-house on that processing. But we'll still, it's always, I think it's an advantage for us to have a external party processing that GPS data so that we can make sure, we're getting the expertise there, but also I think it's beneficial for us to have an external entity to be doing that. We'll continue with our NSAR research and data collection. I think that we saw this year with the annual data report that the NSAR data set is really powerful when it comes to looking in between the dots in our GPS network. So we'll continue to do that with Texas A&M, CPI, and with SkyGeo. SkyGeo provided that data set that we had this year, and we'll see that continue. We'll be in year 3 of our network upgrade course, so that will continue. And we'll be in the 2nd year of the Northeast Regional Alternative Water Supply Project. Remember that? That's the project that's looking at the availability of alternative water supplies east of Lake Houston, essentially, basically everywhere in Harris County, east of San Diego. And then, we'll continue with our primary alternative river source base load in Brazos River. That was the project we're doing with Texas Water Development Board, which we've already contributed to. So there won't be any additional costs for that next year. That project will continue. Then looking into the future, again, economic impacts of subsidence in urban areas, it's really looking at, besides the flooding part, we still will probably do in another basin in Harris County, we'll begin the process there. But ultimately looking at other types of economic impacts that come with subsidence and compaction in the system. We have some planned research focused on the development of seawater desal, finishing up the feasibility study on seawater desal. I know that there's a lot of interest in the area on seawater desal, and there'll be opportunities for us to work, continue that process moving forward. Ray mentioned the big groundwater project on the Trinity River up north of us, Mavis Valley Groundwater District. I do expect that we'll be able to contribute and be part of projects that look at any impact of large value groundwater use on base flow in the Trinity River, which for us, I think is a really important thing to try to figure out. Now, I will say that there's some data that needs to be collected and information to be gathered for us to know what that impact is. But there is a possibility that there could be impact on base flow, and that's an opportunity for us to work collaboratively with the Water Development Board, the Trinity River Authority, and others, and help to better understand that. Aquifer storage and recovery. So we talked about this in the past. We had a study back in 2017. We looked at ASR as it relates to a subsidence neutral ASR approach. We evaluated 2 different processes for ASR. One where we take excess take or pay every year, pump it in, and then 5 years out for a drought, we take it out. Evaluated that versus subsidence, and there really wasn't any difference between doing that approach versus using groundwater. However, when we looked at it on a desktop exercise of doing seasonal peaking, where we put in excess take or pay in the wintertime and then take it out in summertime, we did see about a 30% reduction in the overall subsidence that would occur versus using groundwater. So at least that initial study seemed to suggest that there may be a benefit to an ASR if it was following that type of methodology. But one of the big recommendations after that was, if anybody decided they want to do an ASR in our area, we want to go through that process again on a site-specific basis, and really look at it in a site-specific way.